My daughter said, "You'll eat after everyone else." Those 6 words shattered 43 years of motherhood, like winter frost splitting old oak. Not the shouting kind of break, not the dramatic collapse you see in movies, just a clean, quiet crack that runs so deep you feel it in your bones before you understand what's happened. I stood there in Julia's dining room holding the roast I'd spent 8 hours preparing. The meat glistened under her chandelier, the one I'd helped her pick out 3 years ago when she said my taste was surprisingly sophisticated for someone your age. The carved turkey rested in my grandmother's serving dish, the blue willow pattern chipped at one corner from decades of Thanksgiving dinners, Christmas mornings, and Sunday suppers where I'd fed anyone who walked through my door. But this wasn't my door anymore. The dining room hummed with conversation. Julia's husband Mark carved prime rib at the head of the table, while their twins argued over who got the drumstick from the second turkey. Their friends from the country club laughed at something I hadn't heard: wine glasses catching the light like crystal bells. Everyone looked so polished, so perfect, like a magazine spread titled Suburban Thanksgiving Dreams. I'd been standing behind the swinging kitchen door for 20 minutes waiting for Julia to call me in, waiting like the help waits. The roast had cooled from steaming to warm, from warm to room temperature. The gravy I'd whisked by hand had developed a skin. My arthritic fingers ached from gripping the heavy platter, but I didn't set it down. Some part of me kept believing she'd remember I existed. That's when she finally noticed me hovering in the doorway. "Oh, Mother," she said without looking up from her phone. She was probably posting another perfectly curated photo for Instagram. "You'll eat after everyone else. We need the space for actual guests." Actual guests. I wasn't a guest in my daughter's home. I wasn't family at the family table. I was the woman who'd raised her, sacrificed my career to drive her to piano lessons, sold my jewelry to pay for her college tuition, and moved in with her last year when she insisted I was too old to live alone safely. I was the kitchen help. The room fell silent for exactly 3 heartbeats. Long enough for her words to settle over the gathering like dust over abandoned furniture. Long enough for her friends to shift uncomfortably in their chairs. Long enough for Mark to clear his throat and her mother-in-law to raise an eyebrow that said she'd be talking about this drive home. But not long enough for Julia to take it back. I looked at the faces around her mahogany table. The table I'd polished every week since moving in. These people knew me. I'd made coffee for them during their book club meetings. I'd babysat their children. I'd listened to their complaints about contractors and vacation plans and how hard it was to find good help these days. Now I understood. I was the help they'd found. Something crystallized in that moment like water freezing into ice. Not the confused, apologetic version of myself I'd become over the past year. Not the grateful mother who never complained about sleeping in the guest room that smelled like her teenage daughter's old perfume. Not the woman who'd slowly, politely, systematically erased herself to fit into Julia's vision of manageable family life. I became someone else entirely. I walked into that dining room carrying my grandmother's platter, like I was carrying the weight of every meal I'd ever cooked, every birthday cake I'd ever baked, every holiday I'd ever orchestrated to make other people happy. My footsteps were soft on her expensive rug, but something in my posture made everyone stop talking. I set the roast down in the center of their perfect table, right on top of her pristine white runner next to the artfully arranged gourds she'd ordered online for $47. The platter made a solid sound against the wood final as a judge's gavel. "Thank you for clarifying where I stand," I said quietly. Then I picked up my purse from the sideboard where I'd left it 3 hours ago when I'd still believed I belonged here. I walked past their table of shocked faces, past the kitchen where I'd spent the morning chopping vegetables with hands that still remembered teaching Julia to tie her shoes, past the living room where her children were watching television too loudly. I opened the front door and stepped into November air that bit through my wool cardigan like truth, cutting through delusion. Nobody followed me. Not Julia, not Mark, not their guests who were probably already turning this into dinner party gossip. Not the grandchildren I'd moved in here to be closer to who barely looked up from their screens when I kissed them goodnight. I walked the 4 blocks to my own house through air so cold it made my lungs ache. Each step felt like shaking off shackles I'd been wearing so long I'd forgotten they weren't part of my skin. The house I'd abandoned last year still sat at the corner of Pine and 4th Street exactly as I'd left it. White shutters, wrap-around porch, the mailbox Mark had painted for me the weekend before I moved out. Back then, he'd been kind. Back then, Julia had been concerned about my safety, my isolation, my need for family support. Back then, I'd believed them when they said sharing space would bring us closer together. I still had my keys. The front door opened with the familiar resistance it had always had in cold weather. Inside, everything smelled like lemon oil and time standing still. I'd left the furniture covered in white sheets like ghosts of the life I'd lived here for 34 years. The life I'd walked away from because I thought being needed was the same as being loved. I pulled the sheet off my kitchen table, the one Walter and I had bought at an estate sale, when Julia was 7 and Grace was 10. 4 chairs, though. Grace had been gone 15 years now, and Walter nearly 8. The wood was scarred from homework sessions and craft projects and the 1,000 small rituals of raising a family. I sat in my old spot, the chair that faced the window overlooking my garden. The garden, Julia had convinced me, was too much work for someone my age. In the dying light, I could see the raised beds I'd built with my own hands, now overgrown with weeds, but still holding their shape. Still holding possibility. That's when I allowed myself to remember who I used to be. Evelyn Margaret Hensley, born 1942 in a farmhouse that doesn't exist anymore. Daughter of parents who believed work was worship and kindness was strength. Wife to a good man who died too young. Mother to 2 girls who'd taken such different paths that sometimes I wondered if I'd raised them in the same house. Grace had been the gentle one, the daughter who called every Sunday just to hear my voice, who brought her own daughter Rachel to visit every few weeks until cancer took her at 38. Grace who'd looked at me during her last hospital stay and said, "Promise me you won't disappear, Mama. Promise me you'll remember you matter." I'd kept that promise for 7 years. Then Julia had worn me down with her reasonable concerns and practical solutions until I'd forgotten it entirely. But sitting in my own kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of a life I'd built with my own choices, I remembered everything. The phone in my purse buzzed once, then again. Julia's name lit up the screen like an accusation. I watched it ring 4 times before silence reclaimed the room. She didn't leave a message. The clock on my wall tick-tocked with the same rhythm it had kept for decades. Outside streetlights flickered on like tiny promises that morning would come again. Inside, I sat with the growing understanding that I'd spent the last year of my life auditioning for a role in someone else's story. But this house remembered my story. These walls had heard my laughter, my tears, my late-night phone calls with Grace when the babies were sick. This kitchen had witnessed birthday cakes and homework help, and the 1,000 small acts of love that nobody puts in photo albums. I wasn't visiting my past. I was reclaiming my present. The revelation hit me as I sat in that quiet house, surrounded by furniture that knew my weight, in a space that had never asked me to be smaller or quieter or more convenient. Julia hadn't been protecting me from loneliness by insisting I move in with her family. She'd been protecting herself from having to visit me. I woke up the next morning in my own bed for the first time in 13 months. The mattress still held the shape of my body, still knew exactly how my spine curved and where my shoulder needed support. Walter's side remained untouched the way I'd left it when I locked up the house last October. The bedroom smelled like lavender sachets and old wood like permanence. Sunlight streamed through curtains I'd sewn myself 20 years ago, hitting the dresser where my mother's jewelry box sat exactly where I'd left it. Inside her wedding ring rested next to the pearl earrings Walter had given me for our 25th anniversary. Jewelry I'd stopped wearing at Julia's house because it seemed too formal for someone whose primary job was loading the dishwasher. The coffee maker in my kitchen still worked, though it took 3 tries to remember which buttons to push. I'd been drinking instant coffee at Julia's house. More convenient, she'd said, boxing up my old percolator like evidence of my inability to adapt to modern life. I stood at my kitchen window watching steam rise from my cup and saw my neighbor, Harold Patterson, working in his garage across the street. He looked up when my porch light came on, raised his hand in a tentative wave. I waved back and his whole face brightened with surprise. He walked across the street still wearing his work gloves, a smile creasing his 78-year-old face. "Evelyn didn't expect to see you back." Neither did I. He studied me with the careful attention of someone who'd watched neighbors come and go for 5 decades. "Everything all right?" "Getting there." Harold nodded like that answer made perfect sense. "Julia said you were staying with them permanently. Said the house was getting to be too much." "Julia says a lot of things." Something shifted in his expression. Recognition, perhaps. "Well, it's good to have you back. Neighborhood hasn't been the same without your Christmas lights." After he left, I walked through the house, slowly reacquainting myself with corners and doorways, and the way afternoon light fell across my hardwood floors. Everything was exactly as I'd left it preserved, like a museum exhibit titled, "Life Before Compromise." In my bedroom closet, I found clothes I'd forgotten I owned. A red dress Walter had loved, a blue coat that made me feel sophisticated scarves in colors, brighter than anything I'd worn in the past year. At Julia's house, I dressed in neutrals, muted shades that wouldn't clash with her carefully coordinated color scheme. I pulled out the red dress and held it against my body in the mirror. The woman looking back at me was older than I remembered, grayer, but her eyes held something I hadn't seen in months. Defiance, maybe, or just the simple recognition that she still existed. The phone rang while I was making lunch. Julia's number appeared on the caller ID like a demand for explanation. I let it ring 8 times before the silence returned. An hour later, it rang again. This time I answered. "Mother, where are you?" Julia's voice carried the particular strain she used when managing a crisis. "You left your medication here. I'm worried about you." "I'm home." A pause. "What do you mean, home?" "I mean, I'm sitting in my kitchen drinking coffee from my favorite cup, looking out at my garden. Mother, you can't just move back there without discussion. We have protocols. We have systems in place." Protocols, as if my life were a business procedure requiring her approval. "What we have," I said carefully, "is a misunderstanding about who makes decisions for whom. You're being irrational. Last night was just a dinner party. You're taking it too personally." I set down my coffee cup and watched a cardinal land on my bird feeder. The feeder I'd taken down when I moved to Julia's house because she said it attracted rodents. "Tell me something, Julia. When you were arranging the seating for your dinner party, where did you plan for me to sit?" Silence. "Did you set a place for me at your table? Did you consider that I might want to eat with the family I helped cook for—" "There wasn't room," she said finally. "The table only seats 8 comfortably. You had 9 people there last night, plus me makes 10. "Well, yes, but I don't count as people." "That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean when you called your guests actual guests and told me to eat after everyone else?" Another pause, longer this time. I could hear her calculating, searching for the right combination of words that would make this my fault instead of hers. "You're being dramatic," she said finally. "This is exactly why we thought it would be better if you stayed with us. These kinds of emotional reactions, this inability to see situations clearly." I laughed, surprising both of us. "Oh, I see this situation very clearly. That's the problem. Mother, I'm coming over. We need to talk about this reasonably." "No." The word hung in the air between us like a challenge. "What do you mean, no?" "I mean, don't come over. I mean, we don't need to talk about anything reasonably. I mean, I'm done being managed like a problem that needs solving." I hung up before she could respond. The house settled into quiet around me, but it wasn't the oppressive silence of Julia's home, where I'd learned to move, carefully, speak softly, exist minimally. This was the peaceful quiet of a space that had always been mine, that asked nothing from me except that I live in it fully. I spent the afternoon unpacking the boxes I'd stored in my basement when I moved out. Books I'd collected over decades, photo albums Julia had deemed clutter, cooking utensils she'd said were duplicates of what she already owned. Each item I returned to its proper place felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I'd thought was lost. In one box, I found Grace's last letter to me, written 6 months before she died. The paper was soft with age, her handwriting already showing the tremor that would get worse as her treatment progressed. Mama. It read, "Promise me something. When I'm gone, don't let anyone convince you that you're too much trouble or too set in your ways or too anything. You raised us to be strong women. Don't forget you're one too." I held the letter against my chest and cried for the first time since leaving Julia's house. Not from sadness, but from relief, like pressure finally releasing from a wound that had been sealed too tight. The phone rang again as evening fell. Not Julia this time, but Rachel Grace's daughter, my granddaughter who'd inherited her mother's gentle strength and her grandmother's stubborn heart. Grandma Evelyn. Her voice carried across the distance between us like music. "I heard you went home." "Word travels fast. Aunt Julia called Mom and Dad. She's pretty upset." "I imagine she is." Rachel was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Are you okay?" The question caught me off guard. Not because it was unexpected, but because it was the first time in months anyone had asked about my well-being instead of my compliance. "Yes," I said, meaning it. "I think I finally am." "Good, I was hoping you'd say that." We talked for an hour about her job at the library, her apartment near downtown, her boyfriend who played guitar and made her laugh. Normal conversation between two people who actually liked each other, not the careful exchange of pleasantries I'd grown used to at Julia's house. "Grandma," she said before we hung up, "I'm proud of you." "For what?" "For remembering who you are." After we hung up, I sat in my living room surrounded by the evidence of a life I'd built with my own choices. The rocking chair where I'd nursed both my daughters, the bookshelf filled with stories I'd collected over 78 years, the piano I'd bought used when Grace showed an interest in music, now silent, but still holding the memory of her small fingers finding melodies. I wasn't angry at Julia. Anger was too simple for what I felt. I was disappointed, yes, and hurt by the casual cruelty of her dismissal. But more than that, I was awake. Awake to the slow erosion of my independence I'd allowed to happen. Awake to the way I'd traded my identity for the illusion of being needed. Most importantly, I was awake to the fact that I still had choices. The house phone rang one more time that night. Julia again. I let it ring until it stopped, then unplugged the cord from the wall. Whatever she needed to say could wait until I was ready to hear it, if I ever was. The papers arrived by registered mail on Thursday morning, delivered by a nervous young postal worker who asked me to sign 3 different forms. Official envelopes with Julia's attorney's letterhead, the kind that make your stomach drop before you even break the seal. Inside, legal documents typed on cream-colored paper that smelled like expensive printer toner, and other people's certainty about what was best for my life. A petition for guardianship, medical assessments I'd never consented to, psychological evaluations based on observed behavioral changes, and concerning episodes of confusion and irrationality. I read every word twice standing in my kitchen while morning light streamed through windows Julia had once claimed were too difficult for me to clean safely. The language was clinical detached, full of phrases like diminished capacity, and inability to make sound decisions, and potential danger to herself and others. According to these documents, I was a different person than the one who'd been managing my own affairs for 78 years. I was confused, emotionally unstable, prone to poor judgment and impulsive behavior. The evidence cited included my sudden abandonment of a stable living situation, my refusal to accept help from concerned family members, and my inappropriate reaction to normal social situations. In other words, I was mentally incompetent because I'd walked out of a dinner party where my own daughter had treated me like hired help. I set the papers on my kitchen table and made myself a cup of tea with hands that barely trembled. Then I called the one person I knew who understood both law and family betrayal. Margaret Clearwater had been my neighbor for 15 years before I moved to Julia's house, a retired family attorney who'd spent 4 decades helping women navigate divorces, custody battles, and estate disputes that revealed the worst of human nature. She was 73 years old, sharp as a blade and completely immune to manipulation. "Evelyn," she said when she heard my voice, "I wondered when you'd call." "You heard Honey, in a town this size, everyone heard. Julia's been making the rounds, telling anyone who will listen how worried she is about your mental state. I shouldn't have been surprised. Julia had always been thorough when building her version of reality. She's filed for guardianship. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "Bring the papers over. We need to talk." Margaret's house smelled like lemon oil and old books, the scent of a woman who'd organized her life around things that lasted. She read through Julia's petition with the methodical attention of someone who'd seen every variation of family greed disguised as concern. "This is thin," she said finally. "Very thin. She's got no medical documentation, no psychiatric evaluation, no evidence of financial mismanagement or unsafe living conditions. But she has witnesses. She has dinner party guests who saw you leave early. That's not incompetence, that's good judgment." Margaret leaned back in her chair, studying me with the analytical gaze that had made her formidable in courtrooms. "What's she really after, Evelyn?" The question hung between us like smoke. I thought about the past year at Julia's house, the gradual erosion of my independence, the way she'd slowly taken over my mail, my medical appointments, my financial decisions, all with my consent, all for my own good. "Control," I said finally. "She wants control." Of what specifically? I thought about my house, my savings account, my Social Security checks that had been deposited directly into her household account for convenience. I thought about the life insurance policy Walter had left me, the one Julia had helped me optimize last year by making her the primary beneficiary. Everything. Margaret nodded grimly. "Then we're going to make this very expensive for her." Over the next 2 hours, Margaret outlined a strategy that was both simple and devastating. We would document everything, every conversation, every interaction, every attempt Julia made to portray me as incompetent. We would gather medical records proving my physical and mental health. We would compile financial statements showing my ability to manage my own affairs. Most importantly, we would force Julia to prove her case in open court, where her motivations would be subject to cross-examination and public scrutiny. "You need to understand," Margaret warned, "this is going to get ugly. She's going to say things about you that will hurt. She's going to twist every conversation, every moment of normal human frailty into evidence of your incompetence." "I know. And you need to be prepared for the possibility that she genuinely believes what she's saying. Sometimes the cruelest children are the ones who convince themselves they're being kind." I thought about Julia as a little girl, always so certain about the right way to do things, so convinced that her way was the only way that made sense. She'd organized her dolls by height and color. She'd rewritten my grocery lists in alphabetical order. She'd corrected my grammar at the dinner table when she was 12 years old. "She's always thought she knew better than everyone else," I said. "The question is whether you're willing to fight her." I looked out Margaret's window at the street where I'd lived for decades, where I'd raised my daughters and buried my husband and learned to be alone without being lonely, where I'd built a life that belonged to me. "Yes," I said, "I'm willing to fight." That afternoon, I drove to my bank for the first time in over a year. The building looked the same, but everything inside had been modernized. New computers, new procedures, young tellers who looked at me with the patient condescension reserved for elderly customers who probably didn't understand technology. I asked to speak with the manager. Thomas Chen had been handling my accounts for 5 years, ever since the previous manager retired. He was perhaps 40, polite but distant, the kind of professional courtesy that made you feel like an inconvenience. "Mrs. Hensley," he said, shaking my hand with the brief, firm grip of someone who had other appointments waiting. "How can I help you today? I'd like to review my accounts. All of them." He turned to his computer fingers, clicking across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. After a moment, his brow furrowed slightly. "I see here that your daughter Julia has been managing most of your transactions for the past year. She has power of attorney for financial decisions." "When did I sign that?" More clicking. "It was executed in December of last year, notarized here at the bank." I remembered that day vaguely. Julia had brought me in to update my banking preferences. She'd said it was routine paperwork, nothing important, just making sure my accounts were properly organized. I'd signed where she pointed, trusting her explanation. I'd like to revoke that power of attorney. Thomas looked uncomfortable. Well, that's certainly your right, but I should mention that your daughter has been very attentive to your accounts. She's made sure all your bills are paid on time, your investments are properly managed. Many families would benefit from that kind of organization. I'm sure they would, but I'd like to manage my own money now. Of course. I'll need you to sign some forms and we'll need to verify your identity. Standard procedure. An hour later, I walked out of the bank with printed statements showing exactly how my money had been properly managed over the past year. Julia had been thorough. I had to give her that. Every bill paid promptly, every transaction documented, every investment decision carefully recorded. She'd also been generous with my money. Payments to her children's private school, contributions to her household expenses, a loan to Mark's business that had never been repaid, regular transfers to something called EH Family Trust that I'd never heard of. By conservative estimate, Julia had spent $43,000 of my money in the past year, all perfectly legal, all properly documented, all authorized by the power of attorney I'd signed without reading, the power of attorney that was now revoked. That evening, I sat in my kitchen going through the bank statements line by line, adding up the casual theft that had been disguised as family assistance. Outside my window, the streetlights flickered on like tiny promises that tomorrow would bring new clarity. The phone rang. Julia again. This time I answered. Mother, I've been trying to reach you for days. We need to discuss this situation reasonably. Which situation would that be? The guardianship petition or the $43,000? Silence. I don't know what you're talking about. I'm talking about the bank statements I picked up today. The ones showing every transaction you've made with my money for the past year. Those were legitimate expenses. Household costs, family expenses. You benefited from all of those payments. Did I benefit from your children's tuition? Did I benefit from the loan to Mark's business? You're living in my house, eating my food. I was paying rent, $800 a month plus groceries plus utilities, more than enough to cover a room and basic expenses. This is exactly what I mean about your confusion. You're not thinking clearly. You're making accusations that don't make sense. I laughed, surprising both of us. Oh, I'm thinking very clearly. For the first time in a long time. Mother, please, let me come over. Let's talk about this face to face. No, but you should know that I've retained an attorney, Margaret Clearwater. I believe you know her reputation. Another long silence. You're making a mistake, Julia said finally. Her voice had lost its concerned daughter warmth, revealing something colder underneath. You're not thinking about what's best for the family. I'm thinking about what's best for me. That's what competent people do. I hung up before she could respond. Outside November, wind rattled my windows like old bones settling into place. But inside my house felt solid, permanent mine. I'd spent a year being someone else's problem, someone else's burden, someone else's convenient source of income. Tomorrow I would start being myself again. The court hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in December, 3 weeks after Julia filed her petition. 3 weeks during which my phone rang constantly with calls, I didn't answer my mailbox filled with letters I didn't open, and my doorbell rang with visitors I didn't invite inside. Julia had mobilized her network like a general preparing for war. Her friends from the country club, her neighbors, even my former hairdresser had opinions about my mental state that they felt compelled to share. The mailman mentioned that several people had asked him about my mail delivery habits. The grocery clerk wondered aloud whether I was eating properly. My pharmacist called to express concern about missed prescription pickups. It was a master class in manufactured worry designed to create the appearance of community concern about a deteriorating elderly woman who was clearly becoming a danger to herself. Margaret watched it all with the cold satisfaction of an attorney who'd seen this particular performance many times before. She's overplaying her hand. Margaret said during one of our strategy sessions. Desperation makes people sloppy. We'd spent the 3 weeks building our own case, medical records from my doctor confirming my excellent physical and mental health, financial statements proving my competent management of my affairs for decades, character references from people who'd known me long before Julia decided I needed managing. Most importantly, we documented every single financial transaction Julia had made with my money going back 2 years instead of 1. The total was even higher than I'd initially calculated, $57,000 in unauthorized expenses, plus the questionable family trust that seemed to exist only in Julia's imagination. The beautiful thing about financial abuse, Margaret explained, is that it leaves a paper trail. Every check, every transfer, every payment is evidence of her real motivations. But Margaret had also warned me that guardianship hearings weren't really about facts. They were about narratives about which story the judge found more compelling. The concerned daughter trying to protect her aging mother, or the elderly woman fighting for her independence. Julia's going to paint you as stubborn, confused, and vulnerable, Margaret said. She's going to make every normal human emotion look like evidence of mental decline. When you get angry, you're irrational. When you cry, you're unstable. When you stand up for yourself, you're combative. And when I don't fight back, then you're passive and unable to make decisions. Margaret smiled grimly. It's a beautiful system for people who want to steal from their parents. The night before the hearing, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and Grace's letters spread across the table. 23 letters written over the last 2 years of her life, each one a small masterpiece of love and observation and gentle wisdom. In one, she wrote about watching Julia organize my 70th birthday party. She means well, Mama, but she's so busy managing the celebration that she forgets to actually celebrate you. Sometimes I wonder if she sees people or just problems that need solving. In another written 6 months before she died, promise me you won't let anyone make you smaller than you are. You taught us to take up space in the world. Don't forget your own lesson. I folded the letters carefully and placed them back in their box. Grace had seen Julia's nature years before I was willing to acknowledge it. Children know their siblings in ways parents never can strip of the loyalty and hope that blind us to difficult truths. The courthouse was a stern brick building that smelled like floor wax and institutional coffee. I arrived early wearing my navy blue suit and my mother's pearl earrings, carrying a leather folder that contained copies of every document Margaret thought we might need. Julia was already there with her attorney, a sharp-faced woman named Patricia Holmes, who specialized in elder law. They sat at a table near the front, heads bent together in urgent consultation. Julia wore black, which struck me as either dramatically appropriate or subtly manipulative depending on your perspective. She looked up when I entered the courtroom, her face carefully arranged in an expression of concerned sadness. The face of a daughter who loved her mother but had been forced into terrible decisions by circumstances beyond her control. I took my seat next to Margaret and waited. Judge Eleanor Morrison was perhaps 60, gray-haired and stern-faced, with the efficient demeanor of someone who'd seen every variation of family dysfunction that could be dragged before a court. She reviewed the case file while we waited, occasionally making notes in the margin. "This is a petition for limited guardianship," she announced without preamble. "Ms. Holmes, present your case." Patricia Holmes stood smoothly her opening statement, a carefully orchestrated symphony of concern and reluctance. Julia hadn't wanted to take this step, she explained. Julia loved her mother dearly and respected her independence. But recent events had demonstrated a pattern of concerning behavior that suggested Mrs. Hensley could no longer make sound decisions about her own welfare. The evidence was presented like pieces of a puzzle: my sudden abandonment of a stable living situation, my refusal to accept medical monitoring, my inability to maintain social relationships, my irrational hostility toward family members who were trying to help. Mrs. Hensley has become isolated, suspicious, and prone to dramatic overreactions to normal family interactions, Holmes concluded. She needs protection from her own poor judgment. Then Julia took the stand. She was magnificent, I had to admit, poised and articulate with just the right mixture of love and exasperation. She spoke about finding me confused and disoriented some mornings, about my tendency to repeat stories, about my increasing difficulty managing complex tasks like cooking and bill paying. I suggested she move in with us because I was worried about her safety. Julia testified. She was forgetting to eat regularly, forgetting to take her medications, forgetting to lock her doors at night. None of it was true, but none of it was entirely false either. I had repeated stories sometimes the way everyone does. I had occasionally forgotten to take vitamins the way everyone does. I had once left my front door unlocked overnight the way everyone does. Julia's genius was in taking normal human imperfection and framing it as evidence of cognitive decline. The final incident occurred at a family dinner. She continued, her voice catching slightly with emotion. Mother became agitated over the seating arrangements and left abruptly, taking food that had been prepared for our guests. She seemed confused about what was happening and unable to respond appropriately to a simple social situation. I watched the judge's face as Julia spoke, looking for any sign of skepticism or doubt. Judge Morrison's expression remained neutral, professional, giving nothing away. When it was Margaret's turn, she stood with the quiet confidence of an attorney who'd been doing this longer than opposing counsel had been alive. "Your Honor," she began, "this case isn't about Mrs. Hensley's competence. It's about Ms. Anderson's convenience." She walked the judge through Julia's financial management of my accounts, the unauthorized expenditures, the suspicious family trust that had never been properly documented. She presented my medical records, my bank statements, my tax returns, proving decades of responsible self-management. Most devastatingly, she called Harold Patterson as a witness. Harold testified that I'd been maintaining my house and garden independently until the day I moved to Julia's, that I'd been handling my own shopping, cooking, and medical appointments without any sign of confusion or difficulty, that my sudden move had surprised the entire neighborhood because I'd seemed so capable and content living alone. "Did Mrs. Hensley ever seem confused or disoriented to you?" Margaret asked. "Never," Harold said firmly. "She was always sharp as a tack, still is from what I can see." "What about the incident that prompted her daughter's petition, Mrs. Hensley leaving a family dinner?" "And hindi si tsenenes." Harold smiled slightly. "If I'd been treated like the help at my own daughter's table, I'd have left too. That's not confusion, that's dignity." Then Margaret called me to testify. I'd been dreading this moment for weeks, imagining myself tongue-tied and defensive under Patricia Holmes's cross-examination. But when I sat in the witness chair and looked out at the courtroom, I felt something I hadn't expected: calm. Margaret led me through my history methodically. My education, my career, my marriage, my years of successfully managing household finances and raising 2 daughters, my careful planning for retirement, my responsible management of Walter's life insurance, my decision to maintain my independence after his death. "Mrs. Hensley," Margaret said, "why did you leave your daughter's house last month?" "Because I realized I wasn't living there as family. I was living there as an employee." "Can you explain what you mean by that?" I thought about how to put 13 months of gradual diminishment into words that would capture the full scope of what had happened to me. "Julia didn't want a mother," I said finally. "She wanted a housekeeper who would work for room and board and be grateful for the privilege. When I stopped being grateful, I stopped being welcome." Patricia Holmes's cross-examination was everything Margaret had warned me it would be. She questioned my memory of events, my interpretation of family dynamics, my ability to distinguish between help and control. She made me sound paranoid for noticing how my independence had been systematically undermined, ungrateful for resenting my daughter's financial management of my affairs. "Mrs. Hensley," she said with the patronizing tone reserved for confused elderly witnesses, "isn't it possible that your daughter was genuinely concerned about your welfare? That her suggestions about your living situation were motivated by love rather than any desire to control you? If love requires me to become invisible," I said, "then I prefer to be unloved." The hearing lasted 4 hours. When it was over, Judge Morrison announced she would review all evidence and render her decision within 10 days. Julia approached me as we were leaving the courthouse, her face flushed with emotion that might have been anger or desperation or genuine grief. "Mother," she said, reaching for my arm, "this doesn't have to destroy our relationship. We can work this out." I looked at her, this woman I'd carried for 9 months, nursed through childhood illnesses, cheered at graduation ceremonies, and worried over through bad relationships and career disappointments. This woman who'd convinced a court that I was too incompetent to manage my own life while simultaneously managing to steal $57,000 from me. "No," I said quietly, "we can't." She flinched as if I'd slapped her. "You can't do this to our family. You can't choose strangers over your own daughter." "I'm not choosing strangers," I said. "I'm choosing myself." Margaret touched my elbow gently, guiding me toward the courthouse exit. As we walked away, I heard Julia crying behind us, deep sobbing that sounded like grief or rage or the particular anguish of someone who'd lost something they'd never really owned. I didn't look back. Judge Morrison's decision arrived on a Friday morning, delivered by the same nervous postal worker who'd brought Julia's original petition. This time, the envelope was thinner, containing just 2 pages that would determine whether I remained a free woman or became a legal ward of my own daughter. I read the decision 3 times before the words fully penetrated. Petition for guardianship denied. No credible evidence of diminished capacity or inability to manage personal affairs. Petitioner's concerns appear to be based on subjective interpretation of normal behavior rather than objective medical or psychiatric evaluation. And then, in language that was probably as close to judicial outrage as Judge Morrison allowed herself, the court notes with concern the petitioner's financial management of the respondent's accounts and recommends investigation by appropriate authorities. I sat at my kitchen table holding those 2 pages and felt something I hadn't experienced in over a year: complete victory. Not the temporary triumph of small rebellions, but the total vindication of my right to exist as myself. Margaret called an hour later, her voice carrying the satisfaction of an attorney who'd not only won, but won decisively. "It's over," she said. "You're free. More than free, actually." The judge essentially accused Julia of financial elder abuse in a public record. "What happens now? Now you live your life, on your terms in your house with your money under your control." That afternoon, I drove to the bank to officially close the joint account Julia had convinced me to open. Thomas Chen seemed genuinely pleased to see me, his professional courtesy warmed by what might have been respect. "Mrs. Hensley," he said, shaking my hand with more genuine warmth than I'd seen from him before. "I hear congratulations are in order." Word travels fast. In a case like this, good news travels faster than gossip. I have to say I'm glad you fought back. Too many people don't. As he processed the paperwork to close Julia's access to my accounts, Thomas mentioned something that stopped me cold. "You should know," he said carefully, "your daughter came in yesterday. She tried to make a large withdrawal from the joint account. When I explained that your power of attorney had been revoked, she became quite upset." "How large?" $23,000. She said it was for family medical expenses. I thought about Julia's desperation, her increasingly frantic phone calls, her tears at the courthouse. Not grief over our broken relationship, but panic over losing access to my money. "What medical expenses?" I asked. She didn't specify. "But Mrs. Hensley, I think you should know something else. She's been making regular withdrawals from that account for almost 2 years, much more than the household expenses you were aware of." Thomas handed me a complete transaction history, line by line, month by month, a record of systematic theft disguised as family assistance. Not $57,000 as I'd calculated, but over $80,000 in total. Julia had been stealing from me since long before I moved into her house. The concerned daughter routine, the suggestions about financial management, the gradual assumption of control over my affairs. It had all been a carefully orchestrated plan to gain access to my money. I drove home in a daze, the transaction records on the passenger seat, like evidence of a crime I'd been too trusting to recognize. Julia hadn't suddenly become greedy and controlling. She'd been greedy and controlling all along, waiting for the right moment to implement her plan. That evening, Rachel called. "Grandma Evelyn," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "I heard about the court decision. I'm so proud of you." "Thank you, sweetheart." "Are you okay? You sound tired." I was tired. Bone deep, soul deep. tired in a way that had nothing to do with the legal battle and everything to do with the realization that my own daughter had been systematically robbing me for years. I'm processing some difficult information about your aunt. The financial stuff. Yeah, I kind of figured that was happening. Her casual acceptance startled me. You knew, not the details, but I noticed things. The way she always wanted to handle your bills, how she redirected conversations when you asked about money, how defensive she got when anyone suggested you were capable of managing your own affairs. Why didn't you say anything? Rachel was quiet for a moment. Because I was 25 and she was the adult, and I thought maybe I was seeing things that weren't there. Also, honestly, because I was afraid you wouldn't believe me. I closed my eyes thinking about all the opportunities I'd missed to see what was happening, all the red flags I'd ignored because I wanted to believe Julia loved me more than she loved my money. I'm sorry I didn't protect you better, Rachel said softly. You were the only one who treated me like a person instead of a problem. That was protection enough. Over the next few weeks, I slowly rebuilt the life I'd abandoned when I moved to Julia's house. I hired a local teenager to help with the heaviest garden work, not because I couldn't do it myself, but because I enjoyed the company. I joined a book club at the library where the other members treated me like someone with opinions worth hearing. I started cooking for myself again, small meals that reflected my preferences rather than a family's expectations. Most importantly, I began the legal process of recovering the money Julia had stolen. Margaret connected me with a financial crimes attorney who specialized in elder abuse cases. The documentation was thorough. The case was strong, and Julia's repeated attempts to access my accounts after the guardianship petition was denied had only strengthened the evidence against her. Julia called once during this period 3 weeks after the court decision. Her voice was different. Smaller, less certain, without the authoritative tone she'd used when she thought she had power over me. Mother. She said, I know you're angry, but we need to talk. There are things you don't understand about the family situation, about why I needed to manage things the way I did. What don't I understand? Mark's business is struggling. The kids' school expenses, the mortgage, everything got out of control. I was trying to keep the family together, trying to make sure everyone was provided for. Including yourself. That's not fair. Everything I did was for the family. I'm not family, I said quietly. You made that clear at your dinner party. I was stressed that night. I didn't mean for it to sound the way it did. You meant exactly what you said. I was supposed to eat after everyone else because I wasn't one of the actual guests. I was the help. Silence stretched between us, filled with all the apologies she couldn't quite bring herself to make, and all the forgiveness I no longer felt obligated to provide. Are you really going to pursue this legal action? She asked finally. The money wasn't yours to take. I never took anything. I managed your finances responsibly. You stole $80,000 from me over 2 years. That's not management, that's theft. Mother, please. Think about what this will do to the grandchildren. Think about what people will say about our family. For a moment, I felt the old familiar pull the maternal instinct to protect and sacrifice and smooth over difficulties for the sake of family harmony. The instinct that had allowed Julia to steal from me in the first place. Then I thought about Grace's letters, about her warnings and her wisdom, and her fierce belief that I deserved better than the scraps of love people offered when they wanted something from me. I've thought about it, I said, and I've decided that the grandchildren deserve to learn the difference between love and exploitation before they repeat your mistakes. I hung up before she could respond. The legal settlement took 6 months to negotiate. Julia eventually agreed to repay $65,000 of the money she'd taken, plus legal fees and interest. Not the full amount, but enough to make clear that her actions had consequences she couldn't charm or manipulate her way out of. More importantly, the legal proceedings created a public record of what she'd done. In a town the size of ours, where reputations matter and social connections determine business success, Julia's status as someone who'd stolen from her own mother followed her like a shadow. She moved away that spring, citing Mark's new job opportunity in another state. The house went up for sale quietly without the fanfare she usually brought to major life transitions. She didn't say goodbye. I attended the closing on their house sale not out of vindictiveness, but out of curiosity. I wanted to see the end of that chapter, to witness the conclusion of Julia's carefully constructed suburban dream. The house sold for less than they'd hoped, the market having shifted since they'd bought at the peak. Another consequence of poor planning and unrealistic expectations. Rachel helped me plan a small celebration that evening. Nothing elaborate, just dinner at my favorite restaurant and a toast to independence regained. We sat at a table by the window watching the sunset over the town where I'd lived for 40 years, where I'd raised my daughters and buried my husband and learned to survive. "Do you miss her?" Rachel asked. I considered the question carefully. Did I miss Julia? Or did I miss the daughter I'd thought she was the woman I'd hoped she'd become? The relationship I'd imagined we had. I miss the version of her that existed before I understood who she really was. I said, finally. That's fair. We ate in comfortable silence for a while, the kind of quiet that doesn't need filling. Outside streetlights flickered on like small promises that tomorrow would bring new possibilities. "What now?" Rachel asked as we waited for dessert. "Now I live." I meant it. Not survive, not endure, not manage. Live fully, deliberately on my own terms for whatever time I had left. I was 79 years old in good health, with enough money to be comfortable and enough wisdom to recognize the difference between solitude and loneliness. I had my house, my books, my garden. I had Rachel, who loved me without conditions or calculations. I had neighbors who treated me like a person rather than a problem. I had the hard-won knowledge that family loyalty was only valuable when it flowed both ways. Most importantly, I had myself back. The woman I'd been before I confused being needed with being loved, before I mistook management for care, before I forgot that I was allowed to take up space in my own life. As we drove home that night, Rachel reached across the car to squeeze my hand. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For showing me how to say no, for showing me that love doesn't require you to disappear." I squeezed back, thinking about Grace's letters about the promise I'd made to remember that I mattered. It had taken me almost 2 years to keep that promise, but I'd kept it, and I intended to keep it for whatever time I had left. The rest of my story is still being written. Some mornings I wake up and make coffee just for myself, remembering what it feels like to have preferences that matter. Some evenings I sit on my porch and watch the sunset, grateful for the quiet that belongs to me, rather than being imposed on me. Sometimes the phone rings with calls I don't want to answer. Sometimes I get letters from lawyers or social workers or well-meaning relatives who think I'm making mistakes. Sometimes I wonder if I'm being too hard, too unforgiving, too unwilling to rebuild bridges I didn't burn. But then I remember the taste of that roast I ate alone in my own kitchen, warm and perfect, and entirely mine. I remember the weight of walking away from people who loved what I could provide more than who I was. I remember the strength it took to choose dignity over convenience, truth over peace. If you're listening to this story, if you recognize yourself in these words, if you've ever been told to wait your turn or accept what you're given or be grateful for scraps of attention from people who should love you unconditionally, this is your permission. You don't need anyone's blessing to come home to yourself. You don't need permission to value your own comfort, your own preferences, your own worth. You don't need to justify taking up space in your own life. Sometimes the most radical thing an older woman can do is refuse to disappear. Sometimes the most powerful response to being treated like a burden is to become unavailable for that treatment. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give the people who claim to love you is to stop enabling their selfishness and start modeling what actual love looks like. Love that doesn't require you to shrink. Love that doesn't need you to be grateful for basic human dignity. Love that celebrates who you are rather than trying to manage who you might become. I'm telling you this story not because it has a neat ending, but because it doesn't. Because real life is messy and complicated and full of choices that don't feel like choices until you realize you've been making them all along. Because somewhere out there is another woman sitting at another daughter's table being told where to sit and when to speak and how to be grateful for the privilege. And maybe if she hears this story, she'll remember that she still has keys to her own front door. Maybe she'll remember that dignity is not negotiable, that love without respect is just elaborate manipulation, and that it's never too late to come home to yourself. Even if you have to carry your own roast to get there,